5 games, 1 handheld console. Ideas that would change the course of history for the franchise. Expansions that would redefine what we look at for the 3rd game. A new generation. Becoming a Pokemon. And pinball. Yeah, the Game Boy Advance era was pretty special in Pokemon. Usually the next technological advancement meant we were in for a treat with Pokemon. But what would be the best game released on the Game Boy Advance? Which game really spoke to the crowd the most? Here are the Game Boy Advance Pokemon Games ranked. Before we start, make sure to hit that subscribe button, as it really helps out my channel. And please excuse my voice for this video. I've had a cold for a while, but unfortunately it just won't go away. And the YouTube train can't stop for anything. Okay, so, number 5, Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire. Promotions are always key for a franchise. Usually when a new movie comes out, we used to always have a tie-in video game. I'd say the one that always stood out the most was definitely like Spider-Man 2 for example. Just as fun as the movie, but a nice console tie-in. But sometimes we will have something that's not really common practice. A video game that's going to be released to promote another video game. Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, released in 2003 in tandem with the 3rd generation of games, was released to generally positive reviews. The game infused a very common arcade game that you will find, or that game that was available on the Windows XP that you usually would only play if you didn't have any internet connection. Is that me showing my age now? Anyways, combining some elements of Pokemon such as catching with pinball provided a unique experience for Pokemon fans. The concept was very simplistic and also very repetitive. At the end of the day, there's only so many times you could go around and get a high score, and the Pokemon that were available were simply ones that were available in Ruby and Sapphire, and that is exactly why it is 5th on this list. But I don't think that makes it a bad game. The game is generally quite enjoyable when you just look at the pinball aspect. Simplistic and repetitive? Sure, but as a unique standpoint, this is quite a fun game to pick up and play for a little bit. It's not one you would play religiously, but at the same time it's quite fun. Check it out if you really want to get your pinball action. Number 4, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team. Have you ever dreamed of just one day falling asleep and then waking up in the Pokemon world as a Pikachu? You then end up meeting somebody who becomes your best friend as you make a rescue team that explores the world while helping out other Pokemon, preparing against an impending disaster, dealing with evil Pokemon, while you try to figure out how you have just casually one day woke up and become a Pokemon. No? Is that just me? The Mystery Dungeon series has established itself as a pretty common and well-liked sub-element of Pokemon, one that has received multiple sequels as well as a reimagining/remake. It's a pretty good testament to how the right idea can go a long way. The series all started with Red Rescue Team released on Game Boy Advance and Blue Rescue Team released on the DS. Receiving generally favourable reviews, the game was praised for its innovation and concept idea that really captured the imagination of Pokemon fans. You would wake up one day as a Pokemon and establish a bond with another Pokemon who you'd eventually form a rescue team with. The game allowed you to recruit Pokemon into your ranks and evolve them, as you would explore the world and try to discover how you managed to end up in your current situation. The game really focuses on the emotional impact. First, you are doing a personality test to decide which Pokemon you're going to be, and then you are forming close bonds throughout the game. The gameplay mechanics were unique for the time for Pokemon, coming in a dungeon crawler format, as you would explore and find all kinds of new Pokemon. The game is not all sunshines and rainbows, however. It has received some negative reviews for its difficult spike in certain dungeons, as well as its limited AI control over your teammates and even its RNG elements in terms of items. Still, the game was very different for its time. The reason it finds itself at number 4 on this list is there's definitely more replayability than Pokemon Pinball, and its idea was definitely revolutionary. But on the Game Boy Advance there was 3 main games. Well, technically 5, but we're counting them as entities together. It was never going to get ahead of them, and so it has to settle for 4th on the list. Still, it's worth trying out the game that all started the Mystery Dungeon series for Pokemon. It definitely has its place in history. Number 3, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Now it is time to start talking about the main series games. Long before they were seen to have too much water, which, to be fair, there is a lot of water in these games, but what a ridiculous thing to have a review on. Ruby and Sapphire were the beginning of the 3rd generation of Pokemon games. They were highly anticipated upon release. We were following up on Generation 2, which was without a doubt one of the most favourite generations ever made. Ruby and Sapphire became the first games to hit 2 million total units sold in Japan since Final Fantasy X a year prior, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters 4 a year before that for a handheld game, eventually settling in at a total of 16 million copies sold. A massive amount of games sold, though this was less than its two predecessors on previous handheld consoles. The games were met with some very positive reviews, including their new additions such as double battles and the designs of the Pokemon. Its step onto the Game Boy Advance was a successful one, featuring two evil teams, one for each retrospective game, technically two rivals. Ruby and Sapphire has earned its place in Pokemon history, but why is Ruby and Sapphire placed at 3 on this list instead of 2 or 1? Well, unfortunately for Ruby and Sapphire, the two games above it came out after this game. Both of them used the engine designed for these games, but further expanded upon them and added new additions to the series. Still, even with that, Ruby and Sapphire find themselves in a pretty good standpoint within the Pokemon series, establishing themselves as core members of the franchise as a whole. It is well earning of the spot of number 3. Number 2, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. Fine margins actually separate the top two. I actually think this would be the closest it would be in regarding to Pokemon games. Nowadays, doing remakes is a common theme in Pokemon. Heck, Generation 1 has now had 2 of its own. But Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green is exactly where the concept began, developed, and set a standard within the series. We are now 4 generation remakes, 5 in total in, and still we go back to where it all started. The game breathed completely new life into Generation 1. While loved in its own right as the beginning of Pokemon, after all, they're the reason we are here today, there's no doubting the mistakes, problems and issues in Generation 1 on the Game Boy. We had game-breaking glitches, more errors, problems to the point where you could actually completely rewrite the game to make Pokemon appear at any time. By this stage, there had been key developments that had happened in the Pokemon franchise. We had new Pokemon types to help balance out overpowered Pokemon, as well as having some Pokemon actually be weak to the types they should have been. We had stronger moves, as well as the addition of future generational Pokemon in the post-game, though I still think we should be able to evolve my Golbat into Crobat and not have to see this screen. But at the end of the day, it can't be perfect. We also have the running shoes, the berry system, wireless communication, the ability to use both female and male characters now. The franchise has undergone a massive amount of standard changes that really improve the remake from the get-go. But it's not just the standard life improvements the game gets from Pokemon being further developed as a franchise, however. You also get the addition of things such as the post-game content that never existed, new trades, and new events. The VS Seeker was a great part of the game that allowed you to reface trainers whenever you wanted for better experience or money. What just stops Fire Red and Leaf Green from being number 1 ranked Pokemon game on the Game Boy Advance? It's nothing that's a fault of Fire Red and Leaf Green. There's just something on the other game that is truly impressive and added part of Pokemon that is on another level. Fire Red and Leaf Green definitely have their place in history, and I am putting it at number 2 on this list. And last but not least, number 1, Pokemon Emerald. The third game of Generation 3 takes the cake as the best Pokemon game on the Game Boy Advance, in my opinion. As was customary back in the day, Pokemon will receive a third game in the series to help round off the generation. We have now moved on to DLC being a main focus point that helps complete a generation, but back in the day, the third game was looked forward to every time, and this was released with convincing fashion. Pokemon Emerald stands as one of the highest points in the franchise, not just down to its improvement from the original 2 games, but its post-game content can be both fun and challenging in its own right. Story changes were implemented from Emerald, now featuring both evil teams instead of Magma for Ruby or Aqua for Sapphire, with Rayquaza having a prominent role in the storyline. The game will see improvements to the Pokemon available, we had a change in gym leader and champion, new areas to explore, but where it really shines and sets itself apart from the other games is the Battle Frontier. The Battle Frontier could be as fun as it was extremely challenging, each featuring a set of rules and ideas that would require you to know the ins and outs of the game, as you would battle your way to win the silver and gold emblems of each battle location. These would range from climbing the top of a pyramid to a factory where you could choose rental Pokemon and try to win with Pokemon that aren't your own. I think Pokemon can really be defined by the replayability and its challenge. The Battle Frontier was such an incredible popular addition that in my opinion that pushes Emerald above the Gen 1 remakes, on its way to being the best game on the Game Boy Advance. Heck, the Battle Frontier was so popular it made a reappearance in the Generation 4 third game due to the challenge it provided. Emerald just reigns supreme, just barely as the best Pokemon Game Boy Advance game. So, what does everyone else think? What is the best Pokemon Game Boy Advance game in your opinion? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe as it really helps out my channel, and stay tuned for more content. I've got one that's been in the works for a while that I've been waiting to do, but unfortunately due to illness I've not been able to tackle it. I'm hoping that next week I'll be able to. See you guys.